Well, good afternoon. Happy Friday, June 12th. Mark Milam here. Let's get right to it. So, we're hopeful that we are reaching or nearing a peace deal between the United States and Iran to end the war in the Middle East, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which would bring oil prices back down. We need that desperately. Mortgage rates are very closely tied to the price of oil. And as oil has risen, mortgage rates have risen anywhere from 0.5 to 0.75% since the end of February. That has exacerbated affordability issues. We need that to improve. So we're keeping our fingers crossed and waiting for confirmation from both sides, not just the United States, but also Iran, that we have mutually agreed upon a framework for a deal that will reopen the Strait of Hormuz, lower the price of oil, and of course, the human toll of war being what it is, we're hopeful for lasting peace there in that region, particularly between the United States and Iran. But the real story this week for me was the consumer price index. First of all, let's take a look at mortgage-backed securities. These are mortgage-backed securities on the week. Not a terrible week. We actually picked back up maybe an eighth of a point in rate from last Friday, which was not a particularly good day. So as we move into the weekend and start next week, we're really hopeful that we're going to see a return back to levels from February the 27th. Here's where we were February 27th, much higher. If you draw a straight line across here, and let me see if I can find a way to do that much higher. If you're at February the 27th, we were right up in this area, and that's where we'd like to get back to. As mortgage-backed securities increase in value, interest rates come down. That's what we want. And if we can get back here, that's a heck of a lot better than right here, that we'll see some significant pricing improvement. Fingers crossed for that. But inflation is really the name of the game this past week, and this is the Consumer Price Index annualized figure, and it shows 4.2% inflation for the month of May. That's a year over year look. We can see what happened in April, 3.8, in March, 3.3. This is all because of the war in Iran and the impact that it's had on oil. But that's really not the whole story here. That really the story is we haven't been able to get back to 2% inflation since we exited the pandemic. And that was way back in late 2021, early 2022. We have never gotten back to the Fed's target rate of 2%. And quite frankly, it's a failure of our Federal Reserve to not have achieved that goal. Why? Why is that such a big deal? Well, this is where it gets really interesting, and this is what I think Americans need to pay attention to, and why getting inflation under control is so vitally important. I'm going to flip the screen back around here and go to this real wage growth chart. And what we're showing here, this bright white line up here at the top, is annualized real wage growth every single month since April of 2022. And you can see we had decent wage growth back then. 5.5% wage growth isn't bad. And we come down to 5%. Now we're at 4.5%, down 4%. Now we're at 3.5% as of the most recent reading. That's not terrible wage growth for the past 48 months. But when you adjust it for inflation, when you adjust wage growth for inflation, this is inflation adjusted wage growth down here at the bottom. Well, shoot, even at 5.5%, we were actually negative 2.5 to 3.5% because inflation was running so hot in 2022 and 2023. And we've really never gotten it back in the bottle. And you can see that even when we got to April of 2023, when we finally had net positive wage growth, it's not like it was crazy. We made it to about 1.5% here. We have languished in that area, sometimes below 1%, sometimes around 1.5, maybe just a shade under 2%. And we find ourselves, as of the most recent reading, at 0.3% wage growth. We're missing October here because of the United States government shutdown. So we have a hole in the graph because of October. But you can see when inflation is allowed to run hotter than normal, we wind up with something like 0.2% year over year wage growth for the past 48 months. That is just simply unacceptable. And one of the reasons why Americans feel so strained every single month when they're trying to make ends meet. That is why it's vitally important that this new Federal Reserve chairman and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors do all they can to get inflation back to 2%. It is really a disservice to the citizens to allow inflation to run above target this much for this long. If I can be of any service to you over the weekend, don't hesitate to reach out. Mark.milam at highlandmtg.com.